The image that sealed Ivan's fate wasn't a random snapshot, nor an unfounded suspicion. It was a silent provocation, captured by the very security cameras inside the home of a betrayed man. The video showed Ivan, laughing, entering and leaving his best friend's house. And what might seem like just an ordinary visit was actually a nonverbal code, a mocking gesture. Ivan didn't avoid the cameras. He faced them. He knew exactly where they were, and even so, he walked with the confidence of someone who dares. On the other side, Gabriel Taka watched it in silence. Upon returning from a trip, he decided to review the footage, following an instinct he couldn't explain. What he found wasn't just proof of his wife's betrayal. It was the certainty that the friend he trusted most was blatantly betraying him, inside his own home. But what no one expected was the coldness with which Gabriel reacted. There was no scandal, no immediate confrontation. What followed was a meticulously crafted plan, carried out with a calmness that would unnerve even the most seasoned investigators. This is the dark portrait of what happens when betrayal crosses the boundaries of intimacy and honor. A true story, now at the heart of one of the most complex investigations by São Paulo civil police, exposing the worst side of three people who, until recently, seemed to live a normal life: a successful businessman, his doctor wife, and the friend who crossed the line every day as if nothing would ever happen. Ivan had known Gabriel since long before either of them had stability in life. They were the kind of friends who celebrated every achievement together, opening a business, buying a first car, building a family. They went to the same places, vacationed together, shared bar tables and secrets. It was a friendship that seemed unshakable. Gabriel trusted Ivan so much that he let him into his house even when he wasn't home. He traveled often for work, and during those times, it was common for Ivan to stop by and help Sabrina, his wife, with something in the daily routine. Sometimes to drop something off, sometimes to pick something up. But according to the investigation, those visits became more frequent, and for increasingly questionable reasons. What began as a shared friendship turned into a silent triangle, where only two of the points knew what was going on. It was only after returning from a trip that Gabriel had his first hunch. He didn't find anything out of place. No messages. No reports. Just a feeling that something wasn't right. So he went to the house's security cameras, the ones he had installed himself, and decided to review the past few days. The footage showed Ivan entering the house at odd hours, always when Gabriel was away. But what stood out the most was the way he behaved, smiling, walking calmly, looking straight into the lenses. He didn't look like someone trying to hide a mistake. He looked like someone who felt far too comfortable, far too confident, or far too disrespectful. These recordings completely changed Gabriel's behavior. He didn't confront his wife right away. And he didn't go to Ivan for answers either. On the contrary, he said nothing. And in silence, he began to plan. A few days later, Ivan was invited to an informal meetup at Gabriel's bar. It would be a friendly conversation, a casual get-together. Ivan accepted without hesitation. He had no idea what was behind the invitation, or who else would be present that night. The second man to arrive at the bar was Danilo Guimarães. Officially, he was just an acquaintance of Gabriel. But in the civil police investigation, Danilo would come to be seen as a direct accomplice in executing the plan. From this point on, the line between heartbreak and revenge begins to blur. And what was once merely a marital betrayal transforms into something far more dangerous. There was no tension on his face. On the contrary, he seemed confident, like someone entirely sure that nothing could touch him. Maybe because he still believed Gabriel was clueless. Maybe because he trusted his own deceit so much that he never imagined he was being watched. What Ivan didn't know was that, on that night, he wasn't facing a friend. He was facing a man humiliated, betrayed, and determined not to let it go. Gabriel waited for Ivan to settle in. The two exchanged a few words, had some beer, laughed. From afar, no one would have guessed what was about to happen. The tension was invisible, but it filled the air like static before a storm. At a certain moment, Gabriel stepped away. Not by accident. Danilo Guimarães, the other man involved, quickly approached. In seconds, what looked like an ordinary evening turned into a scene of brutal violence. Ivan was attacked with fury. The exact details of what happened inside that bar are still being gathered by authorities, but the first forensic reports are clear: the intent was to kill. There was no warning. No prior fight. It was a direct hit, planned, devastating. When paramedics arrived, Ivan was still alive, but in critical condition. He was rushed to the hospital with serious fractures and signs of trauma. The medical team fought to stabilize him, and for a brief moment, survival seemed possible. But this story still held one more twist, one involving digital tampering, illegal access to evidence, and a doctor with much to hide. While Ivan was hospitalized, unconscious, his lover, Dr. Sabrina Ayera de Mello, Gabriel's wife, took action. Not as a distressed partner, nor as a concerned professional. She acted methodically, and with one clear goal: erase any trace of her relationship with the victim. According to the civil police inquiry, Sabrina accessed Ivan's phone while he was in the hospital. Using her position and ties to the medical team, she managed to handle the victim's device and began deleting anything that could link her to the case: text messages, intimate videos, compromising images. Every trace of the affair. But there was one problem. The hospital security system had logs, detailed records of who accessed what and when. Plus, police forensic teams were already monitoring the key players. Sabrina's attempt to erase evidence didn't go unnoticed. On the contrary, it became one more sign that the crime went far beyond a fit of rage. It was a plan, a cold, calculated chain of actions. The public prosecutor's office is now investigating whether Sabrina actively helped construct the crime or if she only got involved after the attack, trying to minimize the consequences. What's already known is that, even without raising a weapon, she directly interfered in the investigation by attempting to manipulate evidence. Gabriel Taka, in turn, was detained by police days later. The businessman did not resist arrest. In his statement, he chose to remain silent. His lawyers argue that he was overtaken by an emotional impulse, but the timeline of events, the invitation to the bar, Danilo's presence, the violence of the attack, the attempt to hide evidence, all point to something much more premeditated. Danilo Guimarães, the alleged accomplice, was also arrested. He denies being involved in the attack. Claims he was at the location by coincidence. But there are records linking him directly to Gabriel in the hours before the crime, including text exchanges and phone calls. To the investigators, there's no doubt, he helped set up the ambush. At this point in the story, what once seemed like a simple case of marital betrayal takes on the outlines of a conspiracy. An alliance between husband, accomplice, and possibly the lover herself, to cover up a crime with passionate motives, but nearly calculated execution. Operation Intimate Enemy, as it was named by the civil police, has already compiled dozens of pages of evidence, testimonies, and images. And all paths lead to the same conclusion: Ivan didn't die by chance. He was eliminated for knowing too much, for getting too close, and perhaps most cruelly, for mocking too much. With Ivan between life and death in the ICU, the case quickly stopped being an isolated act of violence and became a high-profile criminal investigation. What investigators found in the days that followed reinforced the hypothesis of a premeditated crime, and began dismantling, piece by piece, the stage crafted by Gabriel, Sabrina, and Danilo. The civil police reviewed security cameras from the bar and other city points. What once were silent, cold images now made sense. In one of the recordings, Ivan appears smiling, making hand gestures, mocking. The provocation was clear. He seemed to enjoy rubbing the betrayal in Gabriel's face, unaware it might be his final act of arrogance. In the next images, Danilo appears, positioning himself strategically near the table, and seconds later, the attack begins. Fast. Precise. No argument. However, what truly sealed the fate of those involved was the digital material seized. Ivan's phone, even after Sabrina's attempts to wipe it, still contained traces of their relationship, audio files, conversations saved in the cloud, and even intimate videos. Forensics also revealed the phone had been handled while the victim was unconscious, and the access came from a hospital's IP address. Confronted with the evidence, Sabrina chose silence. But her silence wasn't enough to stop the police from closing in. From metadata and recovered messages, investigators reconstructed the steps of the ambush. It became evident that Gabriel and Danilo exchanged dozens of messages on the day of the attack. In some of them, the tone was clear: anger, a thirst for revenge and planning. One of the most revealing lines read, "Today he'll learn not to play with someone else's trust." The sentence, which might seem vague, fit perfectly in context. Forensics confirmed the time, the sender, and the recipient. It was Gabriel writing to Danilo, just hours before the meeting at the bar. With that material in hand, the lead investigator requested the preventive detention of both men. Gabriel was located at home and taken in without resistance. Danilo tried to claim he wasn't at the bar at the time of the crime, but the footage clearly placed him there. There was no escape. Meanwhile, Ivan's condition worsened. After several days in a coma, he succumbed to his injuries. The cranial trauma was devastating. His death was officially confirmed on July 4th, and with that, the case took on a new classification. It was no longer attempted murder, but murder, aggravated by vile motive and possible co-authorship. The prosecutor in charge was direct in his statement. We're looking at a crime of passion, yes. But also a calculated, cold crime, disguised as improvisation. Gabriel didn't act in the heat of the moment. He staged a scene. And Sabrina tried to erase the traces afterward. Once the media caught wind of the case, more details about the people involved came to light. Gabriel was known for maintaining a public image of success and composure. A successful businessman, married to a respected doctor, owner of a seemingly stable life. But behind that image were marital crises, infidelity, and a possessiveness that once wounded, turned to hatred. Sabrina, on the other hand, saw her medical career fall apart overnight. The Regional Medical Council opened a disciplinary inquiry to investigate her ethical conduct. After all, she wasn't just a wife cheating on her husband, she was a doctor using her position to interfere in a murder investigation. Danilo, until then an unremarkable name, became co-author of one of the city's most talked-about crimes in recent years. And even without any emotional connection to the victim, he was pulled into someone else's revenge plan, perhaps driven by blind loyalty or a promised reward. With the three formally charged, the public prosecutor's office filed charges, and the case was accepted by the courts. The trial is now moving forward based on technical evidence, footage, forensic reports, and hundreds of pages of messages pulled from the suspects' phones. The trial promises to be intense and public. What began with a silent betrayal became a horror show, recorded by cameras, dissected in labs, and discussed in every corner of the city. And with each new finding, the story gained another layer of cruelty, revealing how an emotional wound, left untreated, can evolve into a murder plot. The courtroom was full. Cameras outside recorded every movement. Journalists rotated shifts to cover the story, while onlookers lined up just to witness the sentencing everyone knew was coming. The trial of Gabriel, Sabrina, and Danilo began a little over a year after Ivan's murder. And even after all that time, emotions still ran high. The prosecutor opened the proceedings with a blunt statement. Ivan didn't die by accident, but by decision. He was chosen as a target, ambushed, and executed by those who, at the very least, should have let him walk away. The prosecution's narrative was relentless. Gabriel, according to the state, orchestrated the crime, driven by wounded pride. Danilo, his accomplice, was the executing hand. And Sabrina, aside from being a moral participant, also tried to obstruct the investigation by deleting evidence and accessing the victim's phone while he was still dying. The defense lawyers tried to shift the focus. They painted Ivan as provocative, unstable, someone who put himself in risky situations. Claimed the attack was impulsive, sparked by devastating betrayal. But the surveillance footage, message screenshots, and voice recordings shared before the crime all dismantled that version. One of the most tense moments of the trial came when forensic experts revealed the attempt to access Ivan's banking app, just hours after his hospitalization. The phone was unlocked using facial recognition with the victim's disfigured face. The attempt failed, but the intent was logged. The investigation found no diversion of funds, but the act added weight to the charge of inhumanity. The prosecution closed with an argument that silenced the jury. This isn't just about revenge. It's about power. About showing who's in charge. Gabriel wanted to destroy Ivan. And he did. Sabrina wanted to hide the truth. Danilo wanted to prove loyalty. They all failed. After 7 days of trial, the verdict was announced. Gabriel was convicted of double-qualified homicide, with aggravating factors of vile motive and ambush. The sentence: 25 years in a high-security prison. Danilo received 18 years, for co-authorship and direct involvement in the attack. As for Sabrina, who wasn't physically involved but tampered with evidence and had prior involvement with the victim, she was sentenced to 9 years for obstruction of justice and moral complicity in the crime. The courtroom fell completely silent. None of the three cried. None apologized. None showed remorse. Outside, public opinion was divided. Many saw the sentence as fair. Others believed Sabrina should have received a harsher punishment. And some still blamed Ivan, saying he brought his fate upon himself. But among friends, family, and co-workers, one truth was undeniable: no one deserves to die that way. Ivan's family chose not to give interviews after the sentencing. In a statement, they simply said, "Justice was served, but it doesn't bring Ivan back. We hope his memory won't be reduced to the crime that took him, but remembered for the joy he spread." The bar where everything happened changed its name and underwent renovation. But those living in the area still recall the case with a hint of discomfort. It became part of the town's history, the kind everyone knows but avoids speaking of out loud. Gabriel is serving time in a maximum security prison. Danilo is in the same facility, though in a separate wing. Sabrina, being a first-time offender and having partially cooperated, is serving her sentence initially in semi-open conditions, but lost her right to practice medicine. Today, when this case is brought up, what shocks people most isn't the brutality of the crime, but the coldness of everyone involved. A betrayed husband. A disloyal friend. An indifferent wife. 3 lives woven together in a tragedy written in blood, silence, and betrayal. And in the end, perhaps the most disturbing part is realizing how quickly betrayal can become a death sentence, when pride outweighs reason, and forgiveness is treated as weakness.